Happy New Year, everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be going through the best books that I read in 2023. I didn't read as many books as I intended to this year, but I did still manage to get through quite a few books, so I'm going to have 10 books that I'm going to talk about today. Let me know down in the comments, what books did you really enjoy reading this year, and also if there are any books that you really didn't enjoy, let me know as well. First up on my list, though, we have a comic book, and this is From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell. From Hell delves into the infamous Jack the Ripper murders of 1988 in Victorian London. It follows the story of Inspector Frederick Aberline, who is investigating the crimes, and the comic is partly historical fiction, partly conspiracy theory, and partly just Alan Moore's imagination. It's a very interesting story, a very interesting take on Whitechapel, and it really brings to life the dark, seedy underbelly of Victorian London. This is the first and only serious comic or graphic novel, if you prefer, that I've read in my whole life, and I really enjoyed it, and it was worth taking the plunge with this. I've always been fascinated by the Jack the Ripper killings anyway. There was a few films of this when I was younger, and they used to really creep me out, so it was interesting to read a comic book telling those stories in a lot more graphic detail than those films did. It's a very gruesome story, and as I said, it really brings to life the dark, horrible life that these women in Victorian London were living at the time, and pretty much anyone who was poor in Victorian London. And it's not just the grisly story and the gruesome deaths, it's also just the way that the illustrations bring the horror of this place to life. All of the illustrations in the original edition were in black and white, and although there was a coloured edition printed, I think later on, I think that actually does a disservice to the aesthetic of the comic, because it actually works a lot better to have it in stark black and white, because this is a colourless world. It's a grim world, it's a dark world, and sometimes there are even certain parts of the comic that really bring this to life, just in the way that there are harsh black and white lines and so many shadows that you just wouldn't get as effectively, I don't think, in colour. So it's something that's worth getting in its original printing. The story itself is also very engaging. As I said, it is partly based on conspiracy theory, so if you're looking for a kind of historical or accurate treatment of the Jack the Ripper killings, then you're reading the wrong comic book. But really, fiction isn't about getting things right, it's about telling a compelling story, and this comic book does that for sure. Next up on the list, we have Donna Tartt's The Goldfinch, which is her third and currently final novel, and this was also the last novel of hers that I read, because I read her books in order. The Goldfinch follows the life of Theodore Decker, who lives with his mother until the tragedy right at the beginning of the novel steals her from him. He's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art when it is suddenly bombed by a terrorist attack, and he loses his mother, and during the aftermath of this attack, he steals the Goldfinch, a famous painting. We then follow Theodore throughout his life as things go from bad to worse. He becomes a pretty terrible person, and all the while this painting is following him around like a millstone around his neck, a symbol of his tragedy and his fall and of his long-lost mother. Although when I did my ranking of Donna Tartt's novels, this one came third, that isn't because I think this is a bad novel. I think this is a fantastic novel, as I think with all of Tartt's novels. It's really worth reading. Tartt definitely wears her Dickensian influences on her sleeve in this one. It feels and reads almost like a mixture of Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, but it's not as optimistic as those novels. In those novels we have the story of a young boy, or in David Copperfield's case, a young man, growing up and making his way in the world with ups and downs along the way. With Theo, things are a lot more tragic. It's definitely much more of a descent into chaos rather than the building up of a young man, although there is some maybe optimism towards the end of the novel. Theo is also a fascinating character. As he progresses in the story, he does become unlikable in the sense of the things that he does, but he always remains sympathetic, and not just because he has a tragic backstory so you're willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's just a very complicated person. He's struggling to maintain his morality and his sense of self, but all around him the seeds for corruption are just too tempting for him, and so he takes them. In fact, Theo might even be my favourite of Tartt's protagonist. It's probably a toss-up between Theo and Harriet from The Little Friend. They're both unique in their different ways. I possibly relate to Theo a little bit more because I'm not a little girl, but still I think they're both very powerful protagonists. At the centre of the story, for me anyway, is Theo's relationship to his parents. He has a mother who he adores and wishes he could be like her, and he has a reprobate father who he hates, but ultimately as the story progresses, it seems that Theo has a lot more of his father in him than he thinks, and in one of the climactic moments towards the end he realises that he has to confront this, and whether he's going to let the shadow of his father kind of ruin his whole life. And I find that really interesting, the sort of ways in which children, despite whatever relationships they have with their parents, how their parents influence them in ways that often they don't realise until it's too late. But it's not just about Theo. This book is a very big book, and it's got a whole host of supporting characters. We have Theo's best friend, a young Ukrainian boy called Boris, and their somewhat homoerotic friendship is again another centerpiece of the story. And Boris kind of reminds me a little bit of the Artful Dodger in the way he behaves and in the way he kind of introduces Theo into this life of debauchery and eventually crime. We also have other characters who also have Dickensian flavours as well, but I'll leave you to investigate those for yourselves if you haven't read this book. If I was to say there were any flaws to this book, it would be that it wears the Dickensian a little bit too much on its sleeve. There are too many contrivances, sometimes deaths that just seem a bit implausible, but I can kind of forgive it because Tart just tells a compelling story with engaging characters, and for me, that ultimately is way more important than if there are just one too many coincidences. Going far back in time, and the next one is technically 3 books or plays, but they kind of come together as a trilogy, so I'm going to put them as a trilogy anyway. And that is Antigone, Oedipus Rex, and Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles. These are called the Theban plays by Sophocles, and they deal with the tragedy of Oedipus, who, for anyone who doesn't know, he married his mother and killed his father. And this is the central story that we get in the play Oedipus Rex. Oedipus at Colonus picks up when Oedipus is at the end of his life, he's approaching death, and it deals with how he is going to approach that death, and also him cursing his sons who have not been very kind to their father, who they've just basically left in disgrace. Antigone tells the story of Oedipus's daughter, Antigone, and she, at the beginning of the story, is in a situation where her brothers, who have been warring over who will be the king of Thebes, have both died. One of those brothers is being left out by the new king of Thebes, Creon, to basically rot, and Antigone doesn't want to let him rot. She wants to bury him properly, and so we get this tension between familial duty and duty to one's leader, and Antigone chooses her brother and family over the political leader. And it deals with the tragic fallout of this, both for her and also for King Creon, who is a character who appears throughout all 3 plays, and initially he seems alright, but as the plays unravel, he becomes a much more horrible and villainous force. Antigone also appears in all 3 plays. I think she's only a child or even a baby in the first play. In the second one, she is by her father's side, and then in the third one, we have her after her father has died. Although Greek tragedies typically did come in trilogies, this set of plays isn't actually part of a trilogy. They're from different trilogies, but they do come together chronologically to form a very tight unit. And I really like Sophocles. I think he's my favourite of the Greek tragedians, and he's the one that I would recommend if you haven't read any Greek tragedies. Partly, the story of Oedipus is quite famous, so it's one that you would know going into reading Oedipus Rex, but also I just think that Sophocles there's just something about his writing style, his characters, the focus on the family drama. I felt like his characters are more psychologically complex than that of the other Greek playwrights that I've read, and I just think the story and trilogy is really compelling here. Each play also has a very distinctive feel. Oedipus Rex is very much a typical Greek tragedy. We have this prophecy of Oedipus, and we know that it's going to end badly, and it's a matter of just seeing how that's going to unfold. Oedipus at Colonus is kind of strange. It's more somber, aside from some moments when Oedipus gets to get a bit leery with the people that have done him wrong. But it's a much softer play. It's not obviously a tragedy in a way. It's almost like a victory for Oedipus when he goes to his death with some dignity. And Antigone is, again, more in the line of a classical Greek tragedy, but it's, again, kind of ambivalent as to whose tragedy it is. Because Antigone, again, although she does have a tragic fate in the story, she goes to it with a kind of dignity, and it's almost like it's maybe King Creon's tragedy, as he is the one who really makes the mistake and watches that unravel for him. In any case, fascinating characters, a fascinating trilogy, and also they're very short. So if you haven't read any Greek tragedies, I'd give these 3 a go. Sticking with plays, but moving forward in time, next up we have Hedda Gabler by Ibsen. Hedda Gabler is an aristocratic woman who has unfortunately decided to marry into a bourgeois middle-class family and a husband who is a pretty boring academic, and she finds herself very bored in this new environment. Hedda before was an aristocratic woman who seemed to live a life of partying and fun, and now she is stuck to a life of drudgery, and she becomes obsessed with the need to act, to do something. But she's also, as a former aristocrat and a woman in her time, incapable of really doing anything, and this drives her to a kind of madness and to do pretty cruel and manipulative things to people that result in some pretty tragic consequences, both for her and others. Hedda is probably my favourite character of the year. She's sometimes called the female Hamlet by critics, and although I wouldn't say she's similar to Hamlet in the sense of who she is, I think it's just in terms of her complexity as a character. She's a character where you could pretty much interpret her in any way. You could give a sort of sentimental feminist interpretation where she's a victim of oppression. You know, she's married to a man, she's incapable of doing anything herself because she's a woman in the time period. But she also does seem quite sadistic, so you could give a more sadistic, maybe femme fatale interpretation of her if you wanted, because she's just such a dynamic character. And when I watched the play and then when I subsequently read it, I really didn't know what to make of Hedda. Sometimes I hate her, sometimes I love her, sometimes I'm sympathetic. All of these things come into the character, which is a really hard thing to get right. The version of the play that I watched was one with Fiona Shaw as Hedda, and she did a fantastic job. So I would definitely, if you can find that version of the play online, I'd recommend reading that one. Next we have a reread for me, and this is Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Sons and Lovers tells the story of Paul Morell and his family life. He finds himself torn between his overbearing mother, who they have a sort of semi-incestuous relationship, at least in a sort of platonic sense, and his love of two different women, who are also, in between them, very, very different. The novel explores the tensions in Paul's love life, but also his attempts to break the bounds of his coal mining background as he tries to make it as an artist. For me, this is a deeply emotional story. It's one that I think maybe a lot of men and boys can relate to, perhaps, in the sense that it's ultimately about a boy and his mother and the difficulties of that kind of relationship. I just really find the whole story very evocative, and I would recommend it to anyone. The way that Lawrence crafts this family drama, the way, for example, he deals with Paul's parents, which covers the first part of the book before Paul is born and when he's a child, and seems more like a background character in his own story. We get this marriage between Paul's mother, Gertrude, and father, Walter, and the two of them, they're from different class backgrounds. The mother is more middle class, the dad is from a coal mining background, and initially you can sort of see why they'd be attracted to each other, but ultimately this was a bad idea, and it just slowly disintegrates as the novel progresses to the point where, they reach the point of no return. And I think Lawrence does such a good job at crafting how slow a relationship does decline. Obviously, sometimes a relationship can just, fall apart in a moment, but a lot of the time it's just little things that slowly build up over time until all the love is gone. And in fact, that's one of my favourite parts of the story. And I would say that maybe the first part of the story is maybe the best part for that reason. That being said, I also find Paul's story deeply moving as he struggles against his class background, as he struggles to navigate how he's supposed to fall for these different women with the shadow of his mother following him everywhere. It is a bit of a Freudian novel, but I wouldn't just put it in the confines of Freud. I think it's a much deeper story than that. So I wouldn't just focus on it on that lens if you happen to read it. But definitely do read it if you haven't read any Lawrence, because I think it's a fantastic book. Maybe not as shocking as something like Lady Chatterley's Lover, but still worth reading. Moving on to what will be the first of a few Shakespeare plays on this list, and we have Julius Caesar. Caesar tells the story of the assassination of the Roman dictator by Brutus and Cassius. And surprisingly to me, because I didn't really know much about this play, aside from who it was about, this assassination happens quite early on in the play, and actually it focuses much more on Brutus and Cassius and the fallout of this assassination and what it does to their consciences. Now for me, I thought this was a fantastic play. I was really struck. I wasn't expecting to like it. I don't know why, but I was completely wrong on this one. I'm not often wrong on guessing what I like, but I was when it came to Julius Caesar. I think the relationship between Cassius and Brutus is probably at the heart of the story, and I think Cassius's character, he might be one of my favourite Shakespeare tragic heroes, even though he's not the central character. That's Brutus, because when we first meet him, he comes across as an Iago figure. He's jealous of Caesar. He's trying to manipulate Brutus to commit this assassination. And you just think that he's going to stick in that mindset. But as the story progresses, he actually becomes a lot more human, and there's a lot more to him than that, especially when there's a wedge driven between his friendship with Brutus, such that at the end of the play I actually felt a lot more sympathy towards Cassius than even I did for Brutus. So that was really clever. I like how Shakespeare was able to give a slightly more complicated villain and almost misdirect the reader or watcher into thinking that this was one type of person, but actually shifting to something else later. Definitely an underrated Shakespeare tragedy. I can see why people say that now. One that I will probably read again in the future. Another Shakespeare play next, and now we have a comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. This play is set in Messina and centres around the love lives of two couples. We have Benedick and Beatrice, a older, slightly witty and sardonic couple, and the more sweet and traditional lovers, Claudio and Hero. This is a fantastic play, and definitely if you want to read a Shakespeare comedy and to maybe see why Shakespeare is funny, I think I would recommend this one, because the dialogue stands up over time. The witty barbs between Beatrice and Benedick are great. Also, both of them have this mentality that I think is somewhat reflected a lot in today's society, which is that they both feel like marriage and love is just overrated. It's, they're kind of above it. They don't need that. and I think that is in the air a lot culturally these days. And so I think there's a lot to relate to in that when it comes to the story, and them two are ultimately realizing that they do need love and they do need each other. The humour really stands. I like these two protagonists because, as I said in my vlog recently, they're just more mature than a lot of other Shakespeare comedic leads. I also find the story between Claudio and Hero quite interesting. Claudio is led to believe that Hero is cheating on him at one point, and Hero, who up until this point just comes across as quite a background character, quite shy. She has a moment where she stands up for herself and her integrity to Claudio, and actually makes him look like a bit of an arse. So I liked that. I liked that little speech that Hero did in that moment. So there's lots of good stuff in this play. It also felt like there were some stakes, which I often find lacking in Shakespeare comedies as well. I can certainly see why this is seen as one of Shakespeare's best comedies, and as I said, definitely one to read if you haven't read any Shakespeare and you just want to get into it. Next we have another reread, and one where I actually changed my mind quite a lot on this second read, and that is the Iliad by Homer. This epic play is set during the last kind of leg of the Trojan War, and it focuses on the rage of Achilles and the aftermath of this rage. Achilles is a Greek tragic character who knows that he's going to die at some point, and so he has lots of internal monologues about what is the point of fighting for people who disrespect him when ultimately it's not going to give him any personal glory. When I first read the Iliad, it was coming on the heels of having read the Odyssey, which I read first. And I really liked the Odyssey, and I think because going into the Iliad I then had this expectation from the Odyssey that I didn't appreciate the Iliad for what it was, which is just a very different kind of story. Although both of them are epic poems, the Odyssey is a much more personal journey centered around the life of a particular character, Odysseus, whereas the Iliad, although of course is about Achilles, it's also about war in general. And actually a lot of the poem doesn't even feature Achilles. It features, soldiers that would otherwise be nameless, or side characters, or Prince Hector from the Trojan side. And it just goes into all of these different lives and shows how all of these men who are just dying, nameless soldiers, all had their own lives. In fact, when I first read the poem, there is a chapter, I think it's the second chapter, where we just get a long list of the ships and the various men and fighters, and I found this so boring. But on my next read, I really appreciated that, because what it did, by giving us the lives of these men that are about to just go to war and be skewered in very violent ways, which the poem also goes into a great deal into, it just shows how sad that is. These are people, these are men who were promising in their villages. They might have been the best archer, or they might be recently married, they might just have a child, or they might even be someone who is revered for their intellectual pursuits, or whatever it is. They're all coming to this war, and they're all just going to be skewered on the end of sticks, and there's nothing that you can do about that. And I actually really appreciated that aspect of the poem, the fact that it doesn't really leave any stone unturned when it comes to war and the sacrifices that people who go to war are making. I also find it a deeply empathetic poem as well, which is surprising. You would expect the poem to be much more on the Greek side, because Homer was Greek, but actually a lot of the Trojans come across as sympathetic, especially Prince Hector. And also Helen is given a somewhat sympathetic treatment as well. You would expect her just to be portrayed as a kind of whore, which some of the Greek plays typically sometimes do that. But again, we don't get that here. We get a much more sympathetic treatment, which I think is a testament to how great Homer is as a writer. In fact, sometimes it feels like the Greeks are the ones who are not so nice. It's definitely a difficult read. It's not a poem that you can just sit back and you'll just get it and enjoy, perhaps in the way that you might another normal novel or poem, but it's worth, I think, persisting with, and I'm really glad that I did. Next we have The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. This tells the story of little Nell and her grandfather, who are forced to flee from their little curiosity shop at the beginning of the novel due to the grandfather getting into gambling debts. Unfortunately for them, they are pursued by their debt collector, Daniel Quilp, a evil dwarf who does all kinds of terrible things, including trying to marry little Nell so that he can get the fortune that he thinks that she has at one point. The adventure takes them through some of the harsh realities of Victorian life, and it's a pretty sad story, and obviously has its very famous ending with the somewhat sentimental, but I still think quite sad death of little Nell. It's also got aspects of Dickens' more picaresque novels because they're travelling around and they meet lots of different characters, some good, some bad, some in between, but always vivid and vibrant because that's what you get with Dickens. Again, I have read The Old Curiosity Shop now twice, and on the first read I enjoyed it, but I didn't think it was going to be a favourite of mine. But on the second read again, I was just able to appreciate it more, and I think part of that is because I was reading it off the back of Oliver Twist, and obviously the Pickwick Papers and Nicholas Nickleby, and I'm just seeing how Dickens, so far at least, in every novel that he writes, he is just making little leaps ahead. He's giving us slightly more complex characters. He's still doing the picaresque thing, but he's telling more unified stories, and it's just nice to see that gradual improvement in his writing. There are also just some great side characters in this one. In fact, little Nell and her grandfather in some ways have not the least interesting story, because there are interesting parts, but some of the side characters are also fantastic. The villains, Sally Brass and her brother, are great. We also have Dick Swiveller, very unfortunate name, who goes from being a sort of doofus, villainous sidekick to actually a very sympathetic character who's actually involved in one of the resolutions to some of the villainy that's going on. And of course we have Daniel Quilp, who is a terrifying villain, one of these delightful theatrical villains that Dickens is so good at. Moving back to Shakespeare again, for the last time. I can't help it, I just read a lot of Shakespeare this year, and if you're reading a lot of Shakespeare, it's no surprise that that's going to come up a lot on your best of the year list. This time we have Love's Labour's Lost, which is a play that I knew existed from its title, but knew nothing about. It tells the story of King Ferdinand and his 3 noble companions who decide to swear off women and devote themselves to scholarship. Unfortunately for them, some women arrive at their castle and they pretty quickly fall for these women and go back on their vows. Unfortunately, there is a tragic ending to the play, which I won't spoil, that somewhat casts to doubt whether this set of lovers will actually unite in the end. And there's some interesting questions in the play about commitment and the ability to keep it. That being said, it's a very funny play, and one that I will need to read again just to get some of the linguistic jokes and tricks that Shakespeare uses, because a lot of it does go over the head, especially if you're watching it for the first time. But you can just tell, just from, even if you can't fully get into the words and their meaning sometimes, you can just tell the way things are flowing off the tongue, that these actors, if you're watching it for example, are really enjoying what they're saying, and you just get the vibe. And it's amazing sometimes that Shakespeare, in his best works, he can tell a story and can convey the sentiment and the emotion, even if as the observer or reader you're only catching every other word. Of course, the more you get the words, the more you can appreciate the power of his language, but it's effective nonetheless that he can do that even with you not getting all of it sometimes. It's not a play that I would necessarily recommend to a beginner, just because I think it is quite dense, and as I say, a lot of the time I was getting the wit more just by making assumptions than I was by truly understanding it. But it's one that I really want to dig my teeth into deeper to get all the references and to really get the most out of this play. Alright, that is it for this video. Let me know down in the comments what you have been reading this year, what have been your best reads, your worst, and what you think of these books, and what are you planning to read next year as well. Happy New Year everyone. Ta-ra.